Good evening, and welcome to the fourth live broadcast of Crosstalks. For those of you watching for the first time, this show is a collaboration between Stockholm University and the Royal Institute of Technology, KTH. We'll get to meet some of the leading scientists in Sweden and the world and talk to them and other thought leaders about issues with a global impact. Speaking of the world, during our last broadcast in late May, we had viewers from 35 countries and we're hoping to break that record today. And as always, at the end of each talk, all of you watching us online have the opportunity to ask questions on the air. You do so by calling us on Skype. We're called Crosstalks TV. Crosstalks TV is also our Twitter handle, and our hashtag is, of course, Crosstalks. Now, we have lots to cover tonight, so let's jump right into our first talk. All human civilization is proof of the astonishing problem-solving skills of this species. We've faced down enormous challenges from the natural world. We've cured many diseases that were fatal in the past, and we have connected almost all human communities to each other. But sometimes solutions to problems create new problems, and that is the theme of tonight's broadcast. We will start with some practical examples. What happens when medicines developed to aid the human organism leave our bodies and enter the ecosystem around us? Or when efficient agricultural production methods designed to end starvation become a threat to our survival? Joining us tonight to discuss the negative and sometimes catastrophic effects of our efforts to make life better are Göran Finnveden, Professor in Environmental Strategic Analysis and Vice President for Sustainable Development at KTH Royal Institute of Technology. Welcome.
Thank you.
Christina Rudén, Professor in Regulatory Ecotoxicology and Toxicology at Stockholm University. Welcome.
Thank you.
Göran Lindbergh, Professor of Chemical Engineering at KTH. Welcome. And joining us from Berlin on Skype is the award-winning filmmaker Markus Imhoof. Welcome to Crosstalks.
Hi.
Christina, pollution, overfishing, overfertilization are some much publicized threats to our seas, but you are working on a less well-known challenge. Could you tell us a little bit about what happens to medications that we take once they've passed through our bodies?
Yes. Well, my expertise is in chemicals. So first and foremost, we should acknowledge that chemicals are abundant everywhere. So they are all around us right now. They are in our clothes, in the furniture, in the cameras, and so on. And our use of chemicals has increased 60-fold during the last 60 years. So 60 times more chemicals are produced today compared to the 1950s. And our regulatory systems to risk assess and risk manage these chemicals has not developed in the same pace. When we talk about pharmaceuticals, they are like a small group of chemicals, and they are very special group of chemicals. They are, of course, designed to be safe for humans, but they are also designed to be not degraded so easily. So that's why they survive the passage through our bodies. They also survive wastewater treatment, and that way they can enter the aquatic environment. And these are molecules that are designed to specifically interact with biological systems, humans as well as animals. So, for instance, in the last decade or a bit more, we have learned that hormones from oral contraceptives also works perfectly well as contraceptives for fish. So two groups of hormones, the estrogens and the progesterones. When fish living outside and downstream wastewater treatment plants are exposed to these hormones, they become feminized and infertile. And just recently, we also discovered a new group of chemicals, anti-anxiety drugs, designed to affect the human central nervous system and also affects fish. So they become calm, fearless, and change their behavior. And this is not dangerous in itself, but it makes them more prone to be eaten by bigger fish because they are not afraid of them and they don't hide the way they used to do without this exposure.
And of course, if this is in the seas, if it's in the system, if these chemicals are in the system, there's a risk that other animals will become exposed to them as well. So this might be an even bigger problem after.
Approximately 200 different human pharmaceuticals has been identified in surface waters around the world, actually. So there are quite a few different substances out there.
Göran, Finnveden, you've specialized in environmental assessments of different systems. And so some of your case studies involve waste management. Would you say that the waste management systems that we have today are any good?
Well, I think they have improved in many parts of the world, but they could be further improved. I think there are great possibilities for increasing recycling, increasing reuse, and also, of course, prevention of waste. Waste prevention is we often talk about the waste hierarchy, and waste prevention is on the top of that waste hierarchy.
It's without any intention of minimizing the importance of this, to the layman, recycling sounds like a very old strategy. It's like I remember that from the 70s. So clearly, I mean, is it still important? We thought we'd kind of solve this. How much more could we do? What effect would it have?
Well, we could do a lot more. There are large amounts of waste from different sectors in society. When we're talking about waste, we often tend to focus about our own consumer waste, the municipal solid waste that we're producing, but that's only around 5 or 10% of the total amount of waste that we're producing in society. So there are large amounts of industrial wastes, etc., that could be reused and recycled in different ways.
Are some of these much more important than others, some categories?
Well, from different perspectives, I mean, some of the waste streams can be hazardous in themselves, but others can be important because there is a lot of energy resources embedded in them. So if we can recycle them, we can save energy and other resources from avoiding that virgin production.
Göran, Lindbergh, you were one of the select few to get a personal meeting with President Barack Obama when he visited Stockholm 2 weeks ago. Can I ask what you were talking about?
Yeah, we were presenting some results on some applications based on fuel cells, so showing different application areas. So we showed a car, a vehicle that's been part of a student project, which is running on hydrogen and a fuel cell, so which can take you the equivalent of 150 Swedish miles, 1,500 kilometers on 1 liter of gasoline.
On 1 liter of gasoline?
Yes, so that would take you here to Gothenburg and back again, and then back again to Gothenburg on 1 liter of gasoline. Just to show that there are possibilities with new technology, combination of new technology, design, and actually a group of students can do this today. So showing that there are really possibilities with new technology to make improvements. But then we were also showing other applications using fuel cells. So one of them was based on waste, actually. So to use, it's a project we involved with together with partners in Spain, where we're using leftovers from olive oil production, and where you digest those to get biogas, and then you can make electricity out of that, and you can make a small farm self-supporting when it comes to energy based on this.
I think you ran past that very sort of briefly. I did hear you say that students have developed a car that can drive 1,500 kilometers on 1 liter of gasoline. And you said students can do it now, as though that means that it's something very trivial. But at least it sounds like something relatively easy. Why aren't we driving these cars?
Of course, the car we showed is I wouldn't like to drive it together with other cars. Here you had a car with a weight of 45 kilos or something like that, and to smash into a big car, 2,000 kilos with that. So you need to change more than just the cars. You need to do something about the whole transport system. But it shows that there are potential to give people mobility with a much lower cost for when it comes to energy and the environmental burden from it. So that's, I think, what it's showing.
I think so the transport system, obviously, globally even, is one sector where our urge to make things easier and better for humanity have had unpredictable big consequences. Let's take this constructive, hopeful message that there might be new solutions. Let's put that here. We're going to return to that in a little while. I'd like to turn to Markus Imhoof. The latest of your movies is the award-winning documentary More Than Honey. In it, you take a look at the alarming decrease in the global population of bees. In many regions, 50 to 90% of all bees have disappeared. Markus Imhoof, why is this important?
A third of everything what you are eating is linked to the birth of bees. So the insects and the plants have a cooperation. The plants need to make sex insects, and a third of everything we eat is like this. But also between 70 and 80% of all the plants would this.
We're having some problems with the line. Sorry. Yes, the sound. I'm sorry about the sound.
Mr. Do something else?
Sorry, the line is cutting a little bit.
Oh, is it better like this?
Let's try it. Yes, let's try it.
Or from the mouth. Shall I try it?
Yes, please.
So, did you understand the beginnings that this cooperation between plants and insects is very essential because the plants couldn't live without insects?
Let's have the numbers again. Did you say 1/3 of everything we eat?
1/3 of everything we eat is linked to this work of the bees. And 70% of all, or 80% of all the plants around us need the bees.
So this
Shall I try without headphone?
So this is a very big problem. I think we're going to watch the clip now. Here is a little selection from More Than Honey.
Kein anderes Land der Welt könnte sich die Frage erlauben, die an der Universität Peking erforscht wird. Wer bestäubt besser, Mensch oder Biene? Die Antwort der Wissenschaft ist eindeutig: nicht die Menschen.
Markus Imhoof, what did we see?
This would be the utopic vision already existing in China when the honeybees wouldn't be here, and if humans would have to do the work of the honeybees. And if we would do it, an apple would cost like a Swiss watch. So only rich people would eat and the other one would starve.
Why do you think it is that bees have started disappearing in massive numbers?
There is not one smoking gun to be. One is pesticides in monoculture. So the pesticides is a toxic gas for bees. And on the other hand, monoculture makes the bees starve because, for example, apples are 2 weeks in flower. And afterwards, in the monoculture of apples, there is nothing else in bloom. So it's a desert for the bees, and they would die. So you have to transport them to the next monoculture. This causes stress. And in the United States, for example, they bring 2/3 of all the honeybees to the almonds in California once in February. And they all gather together, and the diseases the bees have are spread afterwards more and more. There is a very dangerous varroa mite coming from China, which is killing the bees. It sucks the blood, and on the place where they suck, the viruses are entering in the bodies. So these are the main reasons, but it's also inbreeding, stress, and all together you can say it's a success of civilization.
Thank you. What did you others think when you were watching this clip, this dystopian vision of hand pollination? Does it correlate at all to your own research areas? Christina?
Well, it's an example of deteriorating biodiversity, which of course has, like Mr. Imhoof says, many factors And I think he points out to several of them, the use of chemicals is one, in this case pesticide, designed to kill. They're really toxic chemicals, but also how we use the land and how we do agriculture. There are some multifactorial problems with this way that can cause these devastating effects.
Göran?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting, very important and very sad illustration of how different impacts and stresses combine into giving impacts on the ecosystem services. I think chemical pollution, land use, there are a number of other threats that also interact here. I mean, climate change will also have an influence on these ecosystem services, etc.
I think here in the Nordic countries, at least, people generally assume that if something is legal, it is safe. If something is, you're already laughing. If I can buy a product in the store, some kind of authority, the government, will guarantee that it will not be harmful to me. I realize, of course, that that is not the truth everywhere else, but I can also deduce from your laugh that that is not the case here in Northern Europe either. Who would like to start?
Well, certainly not. Christina knows much more about this, but anyway, the use of chemicals is under-regulated in many ways. We are allowed, there is no stopping really from having very hazardous chemicals in products like furniture, clothing, etc. There are some areas where there are legal requirements, but other areas are under-regulated.
Yeah, for sure, that's true. One obvious thing is that when we talk about chemicals, or we can also talk about other stressors, like in this case, we only do risk assessments one substance at a time, substance by substance approach. So these bees are probably exposed to, first of all, a multitude of pesticides, fungicides and other types of pesticides that are mixed and spread over these apple trees. And as we talked about, also other stressors that come into play and interact with each other. And society has no systems or processes whatsoever to really deal with these kind of multiple stressors or even combinations of chemicals.
But isn't it also that we have the idea that only the man-made chemicals are dangerous? If we look at tobacco, for example, it's probably the most harmful substance that mankind uses, and that's made by naturally by the nature. So I like to object a bit about saying that it's only that chemicals are only man-made, because most of the chemicals are made by nature itself, right? So sort of.
But some of the most toxic substances we know are, of course, natural toxins, but that cannot be compared with sort of the spread of pesticides in agriculture.
I'm not saying that those are not harmful, but just saying that all natural things are not good as well. So I mean,
I have to object to that. I mean, it is a valid point. We see the point, but at the same time, just because we can fall out of trees that nature has grown, that doesn't make it okay to build atom bombs over here.
No.
I think so. So that maybe it also becomes an issue of scale, right? There are 60,000 commercially available chemicals on the market. This is an approximate number. Nobody knows. It could be much more. It could be twice that. How many of these would you like to banish, Christina? How many of these would you like to take off the market if you could?
Well, the sad story is, as we said, that nobody knows. There are some estimates, like for the new EU regulation for industrial chemicals, has identified 138 chemicals to be substances of very high concern. We know for sure that that number is much too low. We have currently approximately 400 chemicals identified as carcinogenic or toxic to reproduction. We have a list of 800 chemicals that are potentially affecting our hormone system. So it's not like we think that all those 60,000 or whatever are extremely toxic, but we know for certain that there is a number that should be or need to be regulated. And it could be, I mean, if I should guess, anywhere from a few hundred to a few thousand would be my guess.
The terrifying thing about this is that bee death is one of those, it's of course a symptom, but it is one of those things that has consequences of its own. I think as Markus Imhoof made quite clear, with the percentage of everything we grow being a product of the system, let's say conservatively speaking that 1 billion people would die quite fast if bee death accelerates quite rapidly before we have any way of solving this. And so it's, of course I'm pulling this number out of thin air, but I think it's conservative. And I think what worries me is in what order we should act to save the world now with these multiple complex threats. Markus Imhoof.
I guess it's the definition of happiness. If the definition of happiness is everybody has 2 cars and everybody eats twice meat a day, then of course we are destroying our own background. So is this happiness, and who can allow who can afford to live like this, and what is with the people in India? So we have the answer is to understand humans as part of nature, and then it's a game between all the partners. It's like an orchestra. Maybe humans are playing the first violin, but we have to carefully listen also to the cello and the trumpet. And then it's music.
You're all working in different ways with correcting earlier solutions to problems. How did we end up in this incredibly frustrating situation? People wanted to do the right thing 100 years ago and 10 years ago and 200 years ago as well. Is this fundamentally just an issue of sort of life cycle analysis not having been invented early enough?
I think different sciences would answer that question. How did we end up? Why did we end up this? In different ways. I think economists would point out the lack of prices for the environmental damages. When we are using chemicals, we are not paying the price of the damages that they are causing. So that's one reason. Perhaps engineers would point at the lack of technological development. Perhaps policy sciences would point at the lack of institutions and regulations. So I think different scientific disciplines would answer that in different ways. And I think also this points out the way we should move forward. What are the solutions? I think we need technological development. I think we need to get the prices right so that we are paying for the damages. And I think we also need to build institutions and regulations that take care of the long-term investments and the long-term decisions that we have to make.
Are you others optimistic about building these institutions that can act long-term? Are you confident that there is any power at all that has currently that kind of a long-term view? Markus Imhoof.
In my film, you see a solution which nobody has expected. The killer bees are the safest, the healthiest bees on Earth. They can survive, and they can live with the varroamide. They are stronger than all the other bees. But it's a solution we wouldn't have, even it is the killer bees are coming out of a human laboratory. But they are now, for example, in Brazil, where they come from, Brazil has become the 4th most important honey-producing country in the world. And people are afraid of killer bees, but nature have found another solution. We wouldn't have thought about it. So nature does not need us. Nature will find a solution without us. But I'm optimistic for the world, but not for humanity.
For those of us still rooting for a solution where we're still in the picture, who realistically can act to build these long-term solutions? Is it the grad students out here? Should we say to the students, you have to go out and start these companies that will do these things within, let's say, a commercial environment? Is it researchers? Can we build? Because I mean, what we need, of course, is political consensus, but I find it difficult to see, yes.
I think we need a young generation, well-trained. So I think that's why I think education is a very important part of it, and also to be trained to see this in a more holistic perspective, not to be specialized in a very narrow field, but really see the full picture and understand that the technical solution you have to work on or the problem you have to solve must be good in many senses. It's not only a quick fix of something, but really fit into a bigger picture. And I think we have started to change our education in that direction, but we need to do a lot more to really show people this. But I also think there are great challenges or great possibilities for young people really to find a really interesting future to start to work in this field. So I really encourage people to take on that challenge.
There's a bit of the future for everyone to say.
Yes,
basically.
for sure.
Yes.
Because I think it takes these personal initiatives as well. It can't only be regulations or so on. It also takes your own.
Christina, at the same time, we do need to outlaw, for instance, chemical substances.
Yes, I also have, of course, great hope in the next generation, but I think that this generation needs to work too. And I think we need also brave politicians that can take these difficult decisions and turn the development around to a more sustainable course. And we all have a responsibility. I don't think as consumers or even as students, but as Democrats. We have an obligation to learn more. I think we have an obligation to influence societal processes and, in particular, our politicians in a more sustainable way.
So it also becomes part of being a good citizen is to become educated about these issues.
Yes, by democracy, not as a consumer. That's my point. I don't think that everyone should go out and stop buying this or stop buying that. But as democratic individuals, we can affect the future of our society.
Göran Lindbergh, here in Stockholm, we've set a goal to have 0 carbon emissions from cars in 2030. How realistic do you think that is? That's a political goal.
Yes, I think if we follow the trend right now, it's not realistic at all because changes are going far too slow. But I think there are possibilities. Finnveden talked about, for example, waste, not as a problem, but really as a resource. For example, making fuels or making reuse them or make good chemicals out of them. So there are possibilities, but we must. If we follow the pace right now, we won't. I don't think we will make it, because we see that if we look at, for example, electrical cars, they are far too expensive today for a normal consumer to buy them. So the incentive is too small for and I think that's what you're talking about, that it's not enough for an individual consumer to take the responsibility. It must be easy to be a good guy.
Markus Imhoof, you have previously made feature films. You chose to make this documentary about this urgent issue. Why this? Why now?
My grandfather was a beekeeper. He had a canning factory, so the bees were working for producing the fruits. I learned when I was a little boy that the fruits can grow only with the bees. And my daughter and my son-in-law are both bee scientists. And my film is dedicated to my grandchildren because they have to live what we are giving them. So I liked very much these other two answers, pointing the young generation, but also us and the politicians. It's a kind of swarm intelligence we need, and this maybe we can learn from the bees, that they are ready to think how something is good, what they are doing for the whole hive, and we should have the hive. This means the whole world in vision in our personal actions, and that makes it also interesting.
Your film, More Than Honey, is incredibly beautiful. I mean, it's absolutely terrifying, but it's very, very beautiful visually, and it's won many, many awards. Do you think it has had a real impact?
I hope so. I've worked 5 years on the film, and now I'm traveling more than a year around the world with the film, discussing this with the people. So I think it's worth doing it because I wanted to tell this story, and it's important that it goes on, and it has an effect on how things are developing.
From your particular area of expertise, what would be the most important change to effect as soon as possible? If you get to only pick one, you can be king of your field for one day, change a part of the world. Over here, let's start.
Oh, that was a difficult one. From a Swedish perspective, I think the transportation sector needs to be developed a lot more. Today we take, just to go shopping 3 kilometers away, we take this 1,500 kilos car and then bring back two bags of food. And of course that's not sustainable the way we do it. And we see it generally. A lot of, I was last weekend now in Istanbul, and to see the traffic jam down there is amazing. So we see this is a global problem, how to make cities functioning without really this heavy traffic. I think that's a great challenge, because we see more and more people living in big cities also. So I think this is really a big challenge.
Mm-hmm. Christina?
Well, there are certainly a lot of things that need to be done. What's bothering me right now, just to take a detail, is how we work with the hormone-disrupting chemicals. During the last 10 years, it has become evident that chemicals can also interact with our hormone system, and at very low exposures. And this is also affecting unborn, and in particular unborn and small children up to adulthood, and can lead to lifelong disease and problems. The regulatory system we have right now is not at all designed to cope with these kinds of chemicals. We don't have tests to identify them. We don't have risk assessment strategies. And they really float around, and we have no control over them. So within the EU, there is now a work to develop a strategy for this particular group of chemicals. And what we see right now is that the chemical industry is rising to distort this process. And I hope really that we have learned from previous processes to stop the industry from their efforts to weaken and delay work to reduce these risks, because we see them as really serious and costly for society and for humans.
Ultimately, of course, also costly for the chemical industry, because when everybody is dead, they're also not going to make a lot of money. But this is the kind of reasoning that isn't actually in place yet. Yeah.
No, they seem to reason very, very short term. More, if they were to sort of join us and make the world a better place and sort of have control over their chemicals, we can still use them. It's just the bad guys that we want to get rid of, really.
Göran, Finnveden, what would you change?
If I could change one thing in the world, I would introduce a global carbon dioxide tax that would change the energy systems and the transportation systems. And it would make a change, and we probably wouldn't even notice it very much. I think, for example, the carbon dioxide tax we pay in Sweden, it has changed the way we are heating houses, etc., the energy systems very much. And most people don't notice this because we still have a warm house and it's just heated in another way. So a global carbon dioxide tax would make a change without us noticing it very much.
I challenge every Swede who is watching to name the year that was introduced in Sweden. I think people don't even know it was actually that discreet. Markus Imhoof, what would you change?
I would hope that politicians and consumers help that farmers can live with a better way of farming, that it is not a totalitarian industry, but really farming. So maybe the consumers have to pay a little bit more, and the farmers have to be aware what they are doing. And the politicians have to help them that they can live like before, but producing in a better way, and we are eating better food, and we will be happier.
So this is a thing that I started thinking about after seeing the documentary about the bees. Is there a real risk that a similar multiply caused complex of stresses would develop something similar to these bee diseases in humans. And then I thought, well, have we not had increases in all kinds of diseases, from allergies to cancers to obesity and attention disorders, that seem to be larger than you'd expect just from better diagnostics? Is it possible that we are causing some of these epidemics from the environment?
Yes, I think we have great concern right now over a number of these big diseases that you mentioned: obesity, diabetes, cancer, allergies, attention deficit disorders, and fertility. We see like 40% of decrease in fertility in certain populations of humans, for instance. And all of these other diseases are increasing in a way that we can't really explain. And the chemical exposure is probably one of these risk factors. It's very difficult to prove when we have multifactorial causes, because of certainly these diseases are not caused by one cause and one effect. It's multifactorial, all of them. But there is concern. And even if like chemicals would just cause a small percentage of this disease, the cost would still be huge, both in monetary terms, but also, of course, in human suffering.
I think I'd like to see if there are any questions at this point from the audience. Yes, there's one right there. Go right ahead.
Yeah, hello.
Hello. What's your name, please?
Sorry.
What is your name, please?
My name is Eric Leomark. I'm studying my master's in applied mathematics.
Yes.
And so I have, well, what my conclusion from this talk is that information and consumer habit is the major factor, because if you get the information out quicker to the public, the consumers, so to speak, the consumer habits would decrease of such that with increased public awareness of the environmental effects and all of that. But if that would be made from politicians, mostly, wouldn't that be a too long period? Do we need a drastic action now with the consumer habits, or to really accelerate the pace now?
Thank you.
Or is that needed?
Thank you. And I'd like to add to this question whether some of this communication should be between scientists and the general public directly. Of course, we're doing that now in a very popular way, but there seems to be some problems in the communications as it's being filtered by mainstream media. What do you say? Is changing the consumer habits faster the answer?
I think consumer habits are important, but I think we cannot expect that to be the solution. I don't think there is one example of an environmental problem that has been solved by consumer habits. I think consumers and citizens are important in supporting politicians to act, because if consumer habits are to have an impact, consumers must have the information available and how to get the information. Producers of clothes and furniture are probably not very happy to tell that within these products we have put these and these chemicals. So that requires regulations in order to get that information out. So in order to have effective consumer changes, we also need active politicians and active regulation in order to support that. So that goes hand in hand, I think.
Yet we only have the politicians we elect, of course.
Yes, and that's perhaps the most important thing we can do as consumers, select and put pressure on our politicians.
So back to citizenship again. Göran Lindbergh.
Yeah, so this is actually something I talk quite often to my colleagues about, that we'd like, probably working on the wrong problem. We try to develop technology that can make people go on the way they do without really thinking. But I think it would be much more efficient to change people's way of thinking, because then we won't need. I mean, we're trying to fix our limitations in mankind, what we choose and so on. So if people were more responsible when it comes to traveling or things like that, then that would make a big change. But
Christina?
When you wake up in the morning, you take a shower, you wash your hair, you use soap, perhaps a bit of lotion, perhaps some makeup, and already by then you have been exposed to maybe several hundreds of chemicals, like 400 or 500 different chemicals. As a consumer, it's absolutely not possible to deal with that kind of information, even if you had it. It's just too much. So I think the consumer cannot be held responsible in this case. And if we're talking about other types of products like furniture or clothes, there are no chemical contents declaration on these kind of consumer articles. So there's really no way to know what is better or what is worse.
The word drastic action, I think, was the term was mentioned, and I think it's important to remember that in some ways we need drastic changes, but in other ways the changes may not be so drastic. Let me explain. I think the energy systems we have needs to change drastically, but that doesn't mean that the changes for us as consumers and citizens may have to be so drastic. Also looking at the transportation system must change the types of fuels we are using, but that doesn't mean that the way we transport ourselves has to change all that drastically. We will still be able to use cars, we will still be able to travel, but in different ways. So in some senses, drastic actions are needed, but that doesn't have to be mean such drastic changes in our lifestyles.
But I worry that there is also something in our culture, and especially, of course, again, in the cyclical nature of our news coverage, and therefore our collective attention, that makes being anything else than short-sighted quite difficult. There was a big scare about bisphenol A, is that what it's called? Mm-hmm. Yes, I don't even remember, within the last year. And it was all over the media a lot in many countries, how dangerous this substance is, and how many products in our daily lives we get in contact with it. Then it kind of disappeared, and I think a lot of people in the media consuming audience or the citizenship indeed just assume that, well, this has now been brought to the light, the people in charge will take care of it. Have they taken care of it? Or should we, every time something like this comes to the light, should we all start individually and start taking responsibility about following up what happened with bisphenol A, for instance? Christina?
Well, what the decision makers did was to ban bisphenol A from babies' bottles. And that's a very, very good thing to do because, as I said, this is a hormone-interrupting chemical. So reducing the exposure of the smallest children is a very important thing to do. However, it is still allowed into metal food cans. So whenever you open a metal jar with food, you are still exposed. It's still used to line drinking water pipes. So it can still enter the baby's food via the water, for instance. Mm. So exposure is still abundant. We all have bisphenol A in us, and that's only one of the hormone-disrupting chemicals that we are exposed to every day. So banning it from food cans would be a next good step to take to reduce exposures.
Yeah.
I think this is an example of how we somehow have to make a change concerning the paradigm of chemical regulation, that we are still regulating chemical by chemical in application by application. And then we get these kind of alarms, and then we try to solve that, whereas there is these huge numbers of different chemical products used. So we need to somehow move from looking at chemical per chemical and expand in looking at broader groups of chemicals and chemical products.
And find ways of communicating this in a way that it makes it possible to become engaged in the issue long term, even if you're not an expert, I think. Yeah. Can we have another question from the room? Are you also terrified by the end of the world that you don't have it? It can be a small question as well. No, they're all brooding on their solutions. In that case, I'd like to ask you this. If you all look at your respective fields of concern, what are some of the success stories when it comes to dealing problems that humans have caused? Can you mention one that has worked? Markus Imhoof.
The success is that we are still alive and are becoming older and older. So this is based maybe also on chemicals. I guess we shouldn't spoil the pleasure of life with all these discussions, but curiosity is the key of everything. And curiosity gives the information, and then you can participate as a consumer and as a Democrat, and you push the politicians you want to. But I think it would be positive if we would not make the definition by negative thinking.
What do you mean by that? Not make the definition by negative thinking?
Don't do this, don't wash your hair because it's you could be in contact with chemicals to take it all the way around.
So the positive ideas instead, yes. Very good. Do this, do this. Well, then in that case, what are your success stories? Maybe we can find some positive constructs to follow there, Göran.
Well, I think there are several success stories. One example is the regulation of the ozone depleting substances that destroy the stratospheric ozone layer. And I think that's a good example of an international agreement banning these dangerous substances, and the concentrations are going down and the ozone layer is healing. Very slow process, but it's healing. That's one example. I think, again, the Swedish carbon dioxide tax can in some senses be seen as a success story. It has reduced the carbon dioxide emissions from those sectors where the carbon dioxide tax hits. So the problem is that there are a lot of exempts from it, so some sectors don't pay the carbon dioxide tax. But for those sectors that it has hit, the emissions has gone down. So.
Christina, success stories.
Yeah, several success stories in terms of chemicals. I mean, the old sins that we have from the 50s and 60s, like DDT and PCBs, we still have them, of course, because they are persistent, but the concentrations are lowering now constantly. We have some of the fluorinated compounds that were banned, and now our concentrations are going down. Some of the brominated flame retardants, and the same story. So we know for sure that action against these risks have an effect, a good effect.
Yeah.
Being a bit philosophical about it, if we look at fertilizers, for example, 100 years ago, this was a big problem. We were using natural fertilizers. There was starvation around the world. Then we started to make this artificial. Now we know 100 years later that it takes a lot of energy and also a lot of other contaminants that comes with the fertilizer. So we start to see the drawback also. So it's hard to know. At that time, and for a long time, we thought this was really a solution to starvations around the world. Now we're not so sure anymore. And I think many of the solutions we will come up with will, in a short or medium term, look very good, but in a long term, we might find new negative effects that we think now we have a full knowledge about everything, but I think we will sit other people here in 100 years, hopefully, and have the same discussion, and they will say, oh, they were so short-sighted 100 years ago when they talked about this or that, because we underestimate, or we don't have the full knowledge.
You're not making me a whole lot calmer there, but I wonder, I mean, because of course we've become very good at evaluating all the old problems and old processes and old inventions, but have the thought processes changed? Do you all, scientists, when you go to work, do you think more long-term now than people did perhaps in the 50s when they started to use DDT everywhere? Is it built into your work to think 100 years ahead now and 200 years ahead, like they absolutely did not?
I think it is. I think it is, to a larger extent, is built into that you try to put your work in a bigger context.
Christina,
I would say so.
Well, I'm not sure. I think the development is going in that direction, but I don't think we have come very far. If we look at politics, for instance, I think it's still very short-sighted, and economics for sure.
Yeah.
I think to some extent, yes, we have moved forward and looking at a wider scope, but still, I think there is much more to do in that area. Yeah.
Thank you. That is all we have time for in this first session. So what we learn is the positive action is do cooperate, do regulate, do think long term. That'll help at least a little. The scientists will now move backstage to answer your questions directly online, so do keep tweeting. We'll be back on the hour with unintended consequences in the global financial system. See you then.